Hello, I'm Ron Strickland. This webcast is one of a series in which I'm providing some brief lectures and commentaries on topics from the courses I teach in literary and cultural studies. In this installment, I'm going to say some things about the Marxist concept of historical materialism and its importance in the development of cultural theory. I'll begin by situating the Marxist conception of history in relation to other conceptions of history. History, as we commonly understand the term, is in fact a decidedly modern concept. From the perspective of modernity, the ancient historians might rather be considered chroniclers. They recorded the triumphs and defeats of rulers and warriors without the modernist assumption that these events were leading to any necessarily progressive advance of civilization. The early Christian period was characterized by a still more contemptuous attitude toward history. Human history was seen as inconsequential in light of the spiritual truth of Christianity. This attitude can be seen, for example, in St. Augustine's autobiographical confessions. For Augustine, everything that happened in his life prior to his conversion to Christianity was meaningless. Christ was the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end of meaningful human existence. Later Christian writers interpreted history in a way that came to be called providential history. An example of providential history can be seen in Sir Walter Raleigh's History of the World, written at the beginning of the 17th century. In Raleigh's account, world-changing events, such as the discovery of the Americas, are seen as evidence of God's preordained plan for humanity. History involves real change in the lives of humans, but this change is controlled by God, not by the humans themselves. The conception of history advanced by George Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel in the early 19th century assumes that the trajectory of history follows a progressive path. The assumption is that humans learn from their past experiences and that human society becomes more and more civilized. Hegel's conception of history is characteristically modern.
For Hegel, humans are the active agents of history through a process known as the dialectic. History, Hegel argued, is a dynamic process in which a dominant idea, termed a thesis, is opposed by another idea, an antithesis, and the resulting confrontation of ideas produces a third way, a synthesis, in which the two opposing tendencies are reconciled in a combination that includes elements of the original ideas, but which represents an advance of humanity not possible in the previous framework of understanding. Significantly, for Hegel, the realm of ideas is the driving force of history. It is ideas that determine historical change, that determine the social experience of humans. Marx and Engels developed their theory of historical materialism in direct response to Hegel's concept of the dialectic. Like Hegel, Marx and Engels see history as a consequence of human agency. They have a progressive rather than a fatalistic or providential view of historical development. But whereas Hegel had seen the dialectic as a clash of ideas, Marx and Engels see material conditions as a driving force in history. Thus, Marx and Engels famously turned Hegel on his head. For Hegel, ideas drive historical change, but for Marx and Engels, material conditions, in particular the economic forces of production and the economic relations of production, set the terms for the development of human knowledge and society. The Marxist theory of historical process, then, corresponds to the Marxist concept of base and superstructure, in which the base represents the material conditions and the superstructure is the realm of ideas. For Marx and Engels, the superstructure is determined, or at least significantly constrained, by the base of material conditions. Marx and Engels describe this relationship between base and superstructure in slightly different ways in different places in their writings. One example is from the preface to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, where Marx states, "The totality of the relations of productions constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness."
This statement represents one of the most powerful insights of the Marxist analysis of culture. Hence, for example, A political concept such as democracy cannot be understood as an idea developed in an abstract philosophical system, which is eventually put into concrete practice by a group of enlightened political leaders. Rather, the idea of democracy is made possible by a concrete set of material conditions in the first place. And whether or not and to what extent this idea can be realized in any given society will depend upon the material conditions prevalent in that society.
The preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy also provides an account of historical change. Marx recognizes that levels of productive forces are dynamic and will eventually outgrow the capacity of a given set of relations of production to sustain their growth. At a certain stage of development, Marx writes, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or, what is but a legal expression for the same thing, with the property relations within which they have been at work hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an epoch of social revolution. With the change of economic foundation, the entire immense superstructure is more or less rapidly transformed. In considering such transformations, a distinction should always be made between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of natural science, and the legal, political, religious, aesthetic, or philosophic, in short, ideological forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out.
In an early text, such as the German ideology, historical materialism can seem to imply a relatively deterministic causal relationship in which the base, or material forces of production, rigidly determines the scope of action of human beings. But in other places, Marx and Engels provide more nuanced accounts of this relationship. For example, in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, Marx writes,
Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past.
Thus, the question of how rigidly deterministic Marx's conception of history is remains a debatable question. And this issue of historical determinism is crucial for an account of Marx's relationship to postmodernity and to postmodern thought. There are central strands of Marxist theory, notably, for example, Antonio Gramsci's writings on cultural hegemony and contingency, or Louis Althusser's writings on ideological interpolation and the relative autonomy of the superstructure, among others, that would align Marxism with postmodern thought. In addition, there's a considerable body of postmodern thought that might be considered post-Marxist, of writers like Michel Foucault, Jean Baudrillard, and others, who have rejected Marxism, but whose theories of society and of history would not have been possible without the foundation of Marxism.
You've been watching Cultural Theory with Ron Strickland.
If you have any questions or comments as you're reading about and thinking about these issues, send me an email.